Almost every street in America is marked by roads for cars. If you live in an older city like the ones on the northeast coast, you are probably lucky enough to have streets that are comfortable for both cars and pedestrians. Comfortable meaning neither really interfere with the other. But in the majority of America, the car is given priority in almost every way. Roads are made for speeding and driving and not comfort, safety, and walking. Roads are almost always repaired before there are adjacent sidewalks. Many streets don't even have sidewalks or have sidewalks that end abruptly. But what if we flipped it around? What if we prioritized the pedestrian instead? I'll go even further. What if I were to tell you that not every single street in America had to be made for the car? And that the amount that we accommodate for the car is overkill? That actually having all these roads on every street hurts congestion and traffic more than it helps? And that it hurts our cities and pedestrians more than it helps? In this episode, let's reimagine our streets, ignoring the requirement that they must always cater to cars. Let's explore how much we can improve human movement and community by doing so. We'll also talk about some of the concerns in doing so. We're on our road to 5,000 subscribers and we just passed 1,300, so if you want to help the channel out, remember to subscribe for more urbanist content and news. For more updates and content, feel free to follow us on Instagram and Threads. Alright, let's take a look at some reimagined streets. At the tail end of the pandemic, New York City started a new initiative that it called Open Streets. These were streets that were either closed for cars or were turned into shared streets that both cars and pedestrians used together. Pedestrians and bicyclists were allowed to use the entire road, and cars were allowed to drive on it at 5 miles per hour, as well as use it for parking. Jackson Heights is an example of a neighborhood that has kept its open street all year round, from summer to winter. In Jackson Heights, the street has been a huge success. Throughout the day, people can see kids using it to walk to school, professionals commuting to work by bike, or people just using it to get around. But probably even more importantly, the street has become a center for community building. The street hosts many events throughout the year, and many locals just strike up conversation along the street as they walk up and down it. Even while exploring the street, I had 3 locals come up to me and just start a conversation. But why stop here? Or more specifically, why stop with just a few random disconnected streets? What if we adopted this mentality of prioritizing more streets for pedestrians and light transportation the same way we prioritize highways exclusively for cars? What could we achieve? Well, again, this is something that many New Yorkers see once a year during the summer street events. During summer streets, the Department of Transportation opens up whole avenues in New York City. During these events, we see expedited travel times for bicyclists, and we see people who would never be using these avenues anyways, like children and senior people, walking and biking up and down it. But a single open street is not really useful. Just like cars need a network of highways to get around, in order for bike and pedestrian infrastructure to be useful, a network needs to be built with them as well. So let's create some rules and apply them to a neighborhood. Since Jackson Heights already has a head start, let's iterate on it. We'll turn every other avenue into an open street, skipping Northern Boulevard because it's an arterial boulevard, and we're going to make every 3rd street an open street as well. However, every 6th street is going to stop a bit short of Northern Boulevard just to avoid too much conflict with this main arterial. Following this pattern, we now get a map like this, a very dense grid of walkable and safe streets. Firstly, just think about how much breathing room we now have on these streets. Streets that previously were clogged with cars and had their aesthetics robbed by all the parking now look cozy and quaint again. As a pedestrian now, you have so much free space and you're not quartered off to a segment of the road. You can now easily just walk or bike to your destination without the ever-present concern of a 2-ton vehicle colliding with you. Front yard space is now recaptured again by the community. Children can now safely play in the streets without having to get out of the way for a vehicle every now and then. The road is now more welcoming to outdoor gatherings and barbecues. In general, we just have more room for communal practices now. Across the community, we also now have a dense and well-protected bike network. No longer is there this awkward sharing of roads on every block. Bike intersections become faster as we can get rid of the traffic lights. Bikes don't really need traffic lights because they move at a human speed. In general, most road rules are made for cars, not people. The land use in this neighborhood now just freaking skyrockets. With such a layout, we reclaim about 3 million square feet of land from dedicated car space. In freedom units, that's about 58 football fields. With more free zoning rights, we can make better use of these intersections as they provide a lot of real estate. These spots can be transformed into neighborhood centers that host things like shops, grocery stores, and other local amenities. But while I love all this additional green space, there's a more practical part of me that wants to use all of this extra land for housing. This is something I've yet to see considered more in America. In Manhattan, we have these giant 6-lane avenues. In Jackson Heights, we have these 100-foot wide avenues. What if we just built more housing on these streets? Do we really need that many 6-lane roads? In Manhattan, we could build an entire new apartment complex on these streets, while still having roads that wrap around the new development. In Jackson Heights, we could build a whole nother row of townhouses and still have quaint streets for people to walk on. Sure, some of these pathways might get a little tight like in European cities, but isn't that a charm in its own way? But probably more important than the extra green spaces, additional housing, and increased opportunity for community building, this model actually allows more people to move faster. I know we keep telling ourselves that the car is the fastest mode of transportation, but this is really only true if you live in a low population area. Once you get into dense city centers, the car is actually incredibly slow and inefficient. In the city, we constantly see cars stuck in traffic as they caterpillar their way up the avenues block by block. Constant double parking causes further congestion. People are meandering looking for parking spots. Meanwhile, they are all being passed by bikes. In New York City, we constantly see bikes running red lights. This isn't because bicyclists are inherently criminals. This is because they are on average moving way faster across the city streets. And the red lights are not really made for them. They're made for cars that have a much higher rate of killing you if they end up in a collision. Take a look at Google Maps next time you're commuting within your borough. You'll find that quite often the bike is projected to get to your destination just as fast, if not faster, as the car. Okay, I know that at this point there are people who are just shaking their heads at this grand vision of mine. And in all fairness, the criticism is likely warranted. To some, these ideas I've put out are probably just as crazy as the ideas that Robert Moses put out when he wanted to suffocate our streets with highways. But before we get into the counter arguments, if you've been enjoying this video, remember to leave a like and subscribe for future episodes. So let's address some of the big criticisms that come with such a design approach. First and foremost, I will have the car maximalists yelling at me, what about congestion? You're getting rid of all these roads, there are going to be cars everywhere now. Let me tell you a little old story about the Manhattan West Side Elevated Highway. Up until the 1970s, there was an elevated 6-lane bidirectional highway on the west side of Manhattan. Over time, the highway itself became increasingly unstable, and construction engineers in New York City worried that it would collapse within a decade. And boy, were those engineers right. In 1973, the highway collapsed when a cement truck surpassed its carrying capacity. An entire segment of the highway fell down, bringing the construction vehicle down with it and one other unfortunate soul. Fortunately, no one was killed in the collapse. As drivers were slowly escorted off the highway, transportation engineers grew worried that congestion would now build up across Manhattan. Yet, this fear never actually materialized. Manhattan did not see an increase of congestion with the collapse of this highway. And we actually see this phenomenon quite frequently. Removing a road doesn't always correlate with increased congestion. Part of this reason comes from the fact that congestion increases when people have too many options. Intersections, unnecessary lane mergers, and impromptu turns all lead to more traffic and congestion. So if you remove these opportunities, you can actually reduce gridlock across the city. Honestly, if you're trying to improve average speeds for all vehicles, you would narrow down most streets to a single lane and have the cars move across that one lane. Ideally, you would also have these cars start and stop and accelerate all at the same time. And you could even connect them together to do this. And maybe they could all arrive to a station where they could get off. It's a train. That's the joke. This optimal form of transportation, it's a train. The other reason the collapse of the highway didn't cause more congestion is because people will take other modes of transportation. In the case of New York City, people just started using the subway more. And this goes towards the idea that you really get the traffic that you build for. If you build more roads, you'll get more road traffic. If you build more trains, you'll also get train traffic. The difference is that you can load a lot more people in a train before you start seeing the traffic. Another argument you might make is, but Tim, we already have plenty of parks in New York City. Why make more pedestrian exclusive areas? Even a good chunk of the West Side Highway is now a dedicated bike lane and pedestrian area. But what I'm describing is different from a park. A park really is a centralized area in a neighborhood where people aggregate to participate in hobbies or other activities. This pedestrian-focused design accomplishes two things. One, it facilitates more local community building. Instead of people aggregating all across the neighborhood with other random people, we can now build more tight-knit communities in our local block and streets. This is similar to what a cul-de-sac should achieve in a suburban neighborhood. Secondly, this design creates a dense network of mobility. Something like the Western Manhattan bike route really is only good for exercise and moving people up and down the island. But if you're trying to get to one of Manhattan's central market areas, it's really not convenient to get there. Again, just like for a car to be useful, you need a good road network. For bikes to be useful, you also need a good bike network. Okay, there are many more counter arguments I can go into, but I'll end with just one more. What do we do about all the parking and cars we already have? It's surprising me that this is as big of a problem as it is, given that in most parts of New York City, you don't really need a car. But even in Jackson Heights, a lot of the streets look like the overflow stock of a car dealership. Many New Yorkers are enamored with having a car, and some even have multiple. But at the same time, I've noticed more people are trying to sell their car, and many others are starting to bike and e-bike around the area. Which goes back to my previous point, that you really get the traffic that you build for. And as Jackson Heights builds more infrastructure for bicycling, you're going to see more bicyclists. But going back to the dilemma around parking. With this design, you will see more people struggle to find parking spots at first. But over time, I think people will simply sell their vehicle. Even in Jackson Heights, most of these cars spend most of their time not moving. At first, it will be trickier for people to find parking. I expect Jackson Heights to start struggling with some of the same things that Koreatown, Los Angeles struggles with. Koreatown is a fairly dense part of Los Angeles, but because it is Los Angeles, almost everyone in the area still owns a car. The result of which is that parking is insane in Koreatown. And most people who go to visit Koreatown to try out some of the tasty Korean barbecue joints end up parking 20 minutes away from their destination and walking. And I think this is what would happen at first as well, before people start to realize that they don't actually really need their car and start to sell it. But the reality is that if we don't transition from all of our streets being so dedicated to the car, this is going to happen anyways. Right now, New York City is seeing massive development and growth. In Jackson Heights, we're seeing more construction. Along Northern Boulevard, we're seeing more apartments going up. In Greenpoint, downtown Brooklyn, Williamsburg, across the city, you're seeing more and more construction. Furthermore, people are moving to Jackson Heights to raise a family. And one day, these kids are also going to need their own way to get around the city. And in 20 years, what you'll find is that if we don't drastically improve our land use and reduce our car dependency, you are going to see more traffic, more problems finding parking, and more overall congestion. There's even a possibility that if we do not start prioritizing the pedestrian, the experience of just walking around the city will start to deteriorate as we become more and more dependent on the car.